Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to the Competitiveness Summit. I'm Lily Bayer. I cover NATO for Politico, which means that I'm extra excited to be chairing this special panel focusing on Europe and the changing security landscape. And we're really living through a very historic time. In just 2 weeks, NATO leaders will be assembling in Vilnius. They will be signing off on historic new regional plans for defending Europe. They will be looking at how to better work with industry. They will be deciding on a new investment pledge. And I'm sure they will be thinking, what on earth just happened in Russia over the weekend? In that Game of Thrones. And to discuss all of this and more, we have two very special guests who are actually joining us from across town remotely because it's simply such an intense time at NATO headquarters. So they're joining us from headquarters. We have the ambassador of Lithuania to NATO, Davidas Matulionis, and the ambassador of the United Kingdom to NATO, David Corey. Thank you so much, ambassadors, for joining us. And I think I will start with Ambassador Matulionis because your country, Lithuania, will be hosting the historic Vilnius summit in just 2 weeks. And I know that both of you ambassadors have just returned from Lithuania, where you were observing a NATO exercise. And so, Ambassador Matulionis, my question for you is, as the host of the NATO summit next month, what are you hoping to achieve? What are you hoping to see?
Well, thank you very much for a good question. Actually, 12 days we still have in front of us, and it's a very intense period of negotiations in NATO headquarters. And actually, I think at the end of the day, we will reach a compromise. Now we are discussing on very important subjects. First of all, Ukraine is a top issue, and we have to find a formula which would enable Ukraine to join NATO in the future. And we need to, at least from Lithuanian point of view, we need to set a clear pathway for Ukraine's membership in NATO. We are moving forward with some important decisions, which would be also very important. It means increasing NATO's practical assistance package, both short, medium, and long term, and also NATO-Ukraine Council. This is a new instrument, which in our view should be a vehicle for advancement of Ukraine's accession to NATO. And besides that, there are some other very important ideas, because still negotiations are going on. I'm not able to be very specific, but I hope that we will be able to be united. But as I'm always saying, united and to be resolute as well. Unity, imposed unity is not the best solution. We need to have, real unity, and also send a strong message to Ukraine. And also deterrence and defense, you have been referring to regional plans. This is really a revolution. Since the Cold War, we are returning to collective defense in sense of forward defense concept, deterrence by denial, and sending a message that the territory of NATO will be defended from the first inch of, eventual incursion into territory of NATO. And there are some, important processes going on dedicating forces to these regional plans. And I hope we will be moving on this very quickly. From our point of view, it's very important to have full implementation of Madrid decision on scalability of existing battle groups in eastern flank to the brigade size units, and probably have noticed recent Monday's decision during the exercise in Vilnius to deploy in Lithuania brigade size unit permanently. This is a great historical achievement in my view, which is showing, resolve and solidarity with Lithuania and eastern flank countries. And of course, as you mentioned, DIP, so-called Defense Investment Pledge, we are just going in 20 minutes to continue discussion on this. And I hope as well, in the current security situation, we should be ambitious. When, if not now? I mean, when Russia is raging its war, I mean, we need to be ambitious and to set a very clear guidelines on increasing our defense spending, both as a benchmark, a minimal benchmark, and also as aspirational goal. But of course, we're still continuing that, and I hope together with British ambassador's assistant, who is very much in favor of this issue as well as me, we will reach an important decision. I will stop here.
Ambassador Corey, what do you see as the United Kingdom's priorities for the Vilnius summit?
Well, thanks, Lily. And there's a very strong degree of overlap with what Devidas has just set out. We are very ambitious for the Vilnius summit. We think it is going to be a historic summit. We've still got work to do in the next couple of weeks. But I would set out our key priorities as maintaining deterrence and defense, primarily against Russia. The alliance has done well in those terms since Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine last February, but we need to constantly make sure that we are updating our deterrence and defense. And we are in the process, as you noted earlier, of approving a new set of military plans, a new NATO force model, which will really be the biggest transformation of NATO's defense and deterrence posture since the end of the Cold War. So that will be a very high priority for us. There's a continuing wider transformation of the alliance, which is very relevant actually to what the previous speaker was talking about with AI and the need for a digital strategy. NATO needs to continue evolving and adapting to a new world, including improving its digital transformation, putting more investment into defense overall, building up our defense industrial capability. The relationship with Ukraine will be fundamentally important, and we look forward to a big step forward in the relationship between NATO and Ukraine, and lots of practical announcements about further support, both bilaterally and from the alliance to Ukraine. We really hope to see a decision that Sweden will become a full ally at Vilnius. I think there is very, very strong support for that across the alliance. We think Sweden has done all that it needs to do now, and we really want to get Sweden in. So we're very ambitious. We've got a lot to do over the next 2 weeks, but if you haven't got work to do 2 weeks out from a summit, then you probably haven't been ambitious enough. So we'll continue working with Lithuanian hosts to deliver another really historic summit.
Ambassador Matulionis, I think everyone here is wondering, how will Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed mutiny impact the Vilnius summit, if there will be an impact? And in particular, I'm very curious about the Lithuanian perspective, because it seems like at least some Wagner forces are now moving into Belarus. Is that something that you are concerned about?
Definitely, it's a good question. Yes, we are very much concerned, but still there is a gap of intelligence. I mean, we are not able now to confirm that some Wagner troops are moving to Belarus. And of course, we are watching with great attentiveness what's going on there. And of course, we need to consider not simply that was a rebellion, but it could be also some sort of staged action. And if all the Prigozhin people, Wagner is moving to Belarus, it could be a very, very dangerous signal to Lithuania and to the Baltic states, because they are not regular forces of Russia, but they could act in a similar way as 2014. You remember what was happening in Crimea, and therefore we need also to increase our vigilance. We need to strengthen our border control, but also we need to have very clear, policy and readiness of NATO secure in case if something is happening. But I hope it will not. But in the run-up to Vilnius summit, you see that Russia is doing some, provocative steps, and nobody knows, is it a real mutiny or a rebellion, or it's something else, because it's still a little bit mysterious. And therefore, we appreciate so much the Monday's decision of Germany, because it was probably not related to the rebellion in Russia. But it's a very, very strong signal from NATO side and from German side on forward defense of all allies, together, of course, with the national forces of Lithuania.
Just as a reminder to the audience, you can submit your questions, and I'll try to take at least one at the end. Ambassador Corey, how concerned are you about what we're seeing in Russia over the past few days?
Well, as David has said, we're still sort of working through the implications of all this. I mean, primarily, this is about Russia, and this is about internal tensions and divisions within Russia. But I think, in addition to what David has said, it is really worth noting that Prigozhin, in his statement on Monday, Prigozhin, a creature of Putin, totally demolished the false prospectus on which Russia went to war in Ukraine last February. And he's exposed the absolute sort of hollowness of all the arguments that were deployed supposedly to support Russia's illegal and brutal further invasion of Ukraine. So it'll take some time for the implications to work through. We're clear this is about Russia. This is about Russia's internal situation. It's got nothing to do. We didn't play any role in all of this. But what we must do is continue supporting Ukraine. And our government and all allied governments are absolutely resolute in our determination as the Ukrainians take forward their counteroffensive to continue providing them with all the military equipment they need, the financial support, the perspective for longer-term recovery of the country. That's what we've got to stay focused on, supporting Ukraine as it fights to defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity.
Following up on that, Ambassador Corey, the United Kingdom is one of the countries that has been engaged in a conversation about possibly providing Ukraine with security assurances. Do you have a sense of what those assurances could be and when they could be announced?
I mean, my Prime Minister talked about this several months ago at the Munich Security Conference, and he said that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, but that we will not wait for that day to come in terms of providing further support in the meantime. So there are conversations going on at the moment, partly about how we continue increasing our practical military support now, but also how we maintain and indeed possibly increase that support after this conflict and in anticipation of the day when Ukraine joins the alliance. There's a conversation going on between capitals at the moment. I expect more to come out on that in the coming days and weeks. I can't tell you exactly when at the moment, but I'm sure that the main message out of that will be the continuing determination of individual allies and the NATO alliance itself to continue supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes.
One thing we heard from President Zelensky a few days ago is that he really emphasized that he wants, quote, positive decisions from the summit in Vilnius. He called for, quote, real content. Ambassador Matulionis, you talked a bit about giving Ukraine kind of a concrete signal. I know that the conversations are still ongoing, but are you concerned at all that Ukrainian officials could arrive at the summit and walk away disappointed with what they hear?
We have to do everything possible that it would not happen. But it seems that President Zelensky will come to Vilnius, and we will be also preparing important substantive decisions to Ukraine. And as I said, we are working to have a language which would go beyond Bucharest summit decisions. And at least our position is to make accession of NATO to NATO a irreversible process. And of course, we need to find a common ground. In principle, we are very much in favor of integration, all of us, of integration of Ukraine into NATO. But there are some nuances, and of course, they will be settled at the end of the day, I'm sure, as we always, able to reach a compromise in NATO.
We just have a few minutes left, and I know that you are about to go into a discussion about defense investments, so perhaps I should ask you about that. A decade ago, NATO leaders pledged to aim to reach 2% of GDP by the end of the decade in terms of spending on defense. I think according to NATO's latest report, last year, less than a third of NATO allies actually reached the 2%. Of course, your two countries are quite strong on defense spending. But I was curious, Ambassador Corey, what would be your message to allies that still haven't reached the 2%?
Well, we still have work to do on this, but since the decision at the Wales Summit in 2014, which established 2% as an aspiration, there's been around $350 billion worth of additional defence expenditure by non-US allies, so by Europe and Canada. So defence spending has increased, defence investment has increased, but we must go further. We've got to be realistic about the world that we are living in now, and the need for sustained increased investment in defence. I think it's about a third of allies now, but I think by the time we get to next year, we'll be closer to 2/3 of allies. But what we would like to see coming out of Vilnius is a firm commitment by all allies to get to 2% as a minimum. So we would like to see it as an immediate and an enduring commitment. So that is the goal we are setting ourselves as a minimum for Vilnius. And the reality is that many of us will probably have to spend more than 2% over time, given the very challenging Euro-Atlantic security situation that we find ourselves in. So that's what David and I will be talking about in the North Atlantic Council just in the next few minutes. But yeah, there has been success so far in terms of increasing investment, but we still have much further to go, and we want to lock that in as a clear target at the Vilnius Summit.
And from Lithuania's perspective.
In this respect, then I think solidarity is 360. And of course, 2%, it's not a very ambitious goal. Because just remember 2014, when the Wales agreement was reached, Lithuania had 1.2% for defense. Now we reach 2.5%. And we're going to continue probably to reach 3% if we need to invest additional resources into host nation support. And also replenishing stocks, whatever we have given to Ukraine, it also requires additional money. And it's difficult to understand that this opposition to have a 2% of GDP as a minimum, but we are coming closer, and we hope that we will be reaching this agreement, and 2% will be a minimum, and also to have an aspirational goal. At least we would be in favor of having 3% of aspirational goal for defense. Thank you.
One theme that I know leaders will be discussing in Vilnius, and that is also much discussed on this side of town, on the EU side, is how to try to encourage industry to produce more weapons and ammunition at this time. Ambassador Corey, how do you see NATO-EU cooperation on this? Because it seems like both institutions are working on this theme, sometimes somewhat in parallel.
Yeah, it's a really important theme, and one of our highest priorities for the Vilnius Summit. And the reality is that the conflict in Ukraine has exposed some vulnerabilities, and we need to get our defense industrial base into a stronger position, because the likelihood is that whether through continuing support for Ukraine or the requirements in our own national systems, we're going to need to procure much more in the coming years, and we will need the ability to procure more quickly. So we would like to see NATO and the EU working effectively together. There needs to be some kind of effective division of labour between the two organisations. For us, NATO will always remain paramount in terms of Euro-Atlantic security. So we would like to see NATO setting really clear standards that all allies should meet, so that we can do more in terms of interoperability of our defence forces and interchangeability of our defence systems. We would like to see NATO championing more multinational, multi-year procurement. And we would like to see a sustained effort to break down barriers in terms of industrial cooperation across the Euro-Atlantic area. As you say, much of that will be complementary to what the EU is doing, and we welcome EU efforts to strengthen the defence industrial base across Europe. We've just got to make sure it is in a complementary way, that these things don't cut across each other, and whether deliberately or inadvertently, that no new barriers are created. But I'm optimistic we can work that through. because this is a fundamentally important agenda for all of our security for the coming years.
Ambassador Matilionis, do you think that there's room for closer cooperation between the EU and NATO at this stage?
Well, I fully agree with my colleague David in this regard. Definitely, this is the area, in my view, which has a great potential. There is another area, military mobility, we need to continue. And because we need to have standards, we need to have interoperability, replaceability. And those issues are very important. And coordination of EU and NATO is of greatest, value. And we need also both organizations, NATO and EU, to send a strong demand signal to the defense industry. Then we could have a real contracts. Just speaking politically will not lead to reinvigorating and stimulating defense industry. And as David just said, we need to work on the multi-annual and multinational contracts, especially when it comes to standardized ammunition, for example, 155 and other types of ammunition. It's possible, we could do it. And that would be greatest signal, demand signal to defense industry. And also what we are speaking about defense investment pledge, more money, more resources. It's also a signal to defense industry, because at least 20% of this defense budget will be sent to modernization in procuring new stuff. And this is a great issue, and we, Lithuania, are fully 100% in support to UK's proposals, and UK is leading in this respect, and thank you very much.
And maybe as a final fun question, I know this is everyone's favorite guessing game in Brussels. Who will be the next NATO Secretary General? Ambassadors, would you support an extension for Jens Stoltenberg?
Well, Jens Stoltenberg has provided fantastic leadership for the NATO alliance over the last 9 years. He has set brilliant direction. And he's been really inspirational, I think, through the Ukraine crisis, but also before that. There's conversation going on between governments at the moment as we prepare for Vilnius. I expect we will have announcements out on that in the coming days. I wouldn't want to get ahead of that, but I would just pay tribute to the leadership that Stoltenberg has provided so far and continues to provide.
I could only support my colleague David.
Very diplomatic. Thank you so much, ambassadors, for taking the time on such a busy day. And for the audience here in the room, you now get a coffee break. And once you're caffeinated, you can come back into the room at 10:05. And we will have a panel here on the stage in person to discuss defense investment. So I'll see you here shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you, ambassadors.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.